Try this again. The Swiss Reformation, Bruce Gordon. This is chapter 1. Peasants, priests, and soldiers, the Swiss Confederation in the late Middle Ages. Growth of the Confederation. The Swiss Confederation was a creation of late medieval Europe. The Schweiz, which was an appellation, is first found in documents from 1320, derived from the name of one of the founding states, Schwyz. The name Switzerland, as we now use it, was a much later creation adopted in 1803. From the middle of the 15th century, the formative age of the Confederation, the term Swiss found currency, but what it meant is harder to say. With their spectacular victories over the Burgundians, this collection of mountain and valley peoples emerged on the mental map of Europe, acknowledged by others with respect and contempt in equal measure. Most Europeans, forced to consider these people for the first time, conceived of the Swiss as a ruddy, warlike peasants whose ferocity in battle was not only to be feared, but was also for hire. Sufficient money, it was widely believed, was all that was required to hold the loyalty of the renowned peasant armies, which had humiliated and slaughtered, famously the Swiss did not take prisoners, the noble troops of Austria and Burgundy. The stereotype of the typical Confederate as rustic, bellicose, and avaricious, however, conveyed a false sense of homogeneity. While most Swiss were peasants, there was considerable social diversification. The lesser nobility, the urban patriciate, the rising burgher class, as well as the peasantry, formed rungs on the traditional social hierarchy, as they did elsewhere in late medieval Europe. The social and economic changes which swept Europe in the 15th century did not bypass the Swiss. Within the cities, the guilds struggled to dislodge the patrician families, whilst in the countryside, the hand of urban control was increasingly felt. Rural society was hardly homogeneous, employment was not regular for most, and the majority worked as laborers hired by the day for agriculture, which made them itinerant and difficult to control. The Swiss lands had witnessed considerable rural unrest in the late medieval period. Apart from the political rulers, power resided with those with land and livestock who were able to establish themselves as local elites. And the communal networks of family and work framed daily life for most Swiss. 15th century Swiss humanists may have dreamt of a republic of letters rooted... Let's try that again. 15th century Swiss humanists may have dreamt of a republic of letters rooted in antique virtues, struggling against tyranny, but these were the Latinate aspirations of the few. The Swiss readily acknowledged their fellow Confederates as Eidgenossen, and by the middle of the 15th century there was palpable sense of a common destiny, but that did not diminish the jealous regard of each Confederate for the particular privileges which ensured its autonomy. Yummy. The origins of the Confederation lay in the midst of the 13th century when the peoples of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden concluded a permanent pact in August 1291 following the death of Emperor Rudolf I. The departure of the powerful emperor created uncertainty in the empire, and regional forces began to assert themselves, and the communes of mountainous regions around the Wehrwaltenstadter Sea felt threatened. The agreement had several purposes: mutual defense, the peaceful settlement of internal disputes, and the replacement of private feuds with the rule of law. The absence of contemporary historical documents, such as chronicles, has frustrated the efforts of historians to discern exactly what the peoples of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden were attempting to achieve. As more overtly Swiss historical consciousness appeared in the 15th century, a creation myth began to take shape, and writ large in this tale was the figure of William Tell. The earliest extant chronicle account of Swiss origins is the White Book of Sardins, written in the 1470s. Sounds like a Lord of the Rings trilogy. Almost 2 centuries after the events it described, the avaricious counts of Tyrol, according to the Tell story, gained control over the Swiss after the death of Rudolf Habsburg, leading the 3 states of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden together on the Rütli on the shore of the Wehrwaldstätter Sea in an endeavor to free themselves from their evil overlords. One of these, a man named Gessler, a bailiff in Uri, sought to humiliate his Swiss subjects by setting his hat on a staff at Altdorf and requiring all to make obeisance. William Tell refused to bow before this idol, and as a result was compelled to shoot an apple from the head of his son. Marvelously, Tell split the apple with an arrow, but as a reward he was immediately taken prisoner, escaping only when Gessler was later killed in an ambush. The news of Gessler's death stirred the Swiss to revolt, and the three states renewed their alliance. Randolph Head has recently studied the 15th and 16th century accounts of the Tell myth and has argued that they reflect the concepts of freedom and oath as central to Swiss political thought. It is important to remind ourselves that it was the Habsburg dynasty and not the Holy Roman Empire which the Swiss saw as their great enemy. The leading German dynasties, eager to keep the imperial crown away from the Austrian Habsburgs, rather enjoyed the sight of their rivals, humbled by mountain peasants. The three original states of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden won a degree of recognition from the German emperors, but this meant little in the face of the Habsburgs' domination of southern Germany and the Swiss lands. The Habsburgs were not prepared to surrender their lands south of the Rhine, and conflict loomed. The first of the famous string of victories for the Swiss came at Morgarten on the 15th of November, 1315, when the footmen of Uri and Schwyz massacred the mounted knights of Duke Leopold of Austria, who were ambushed whilst passing between a rock wall and a marsh. And before the Austrians were able to deploy in battle positions, they were cut down in a bloody slaughter. This humiliation victory of a peasant army over a noble army was a terrible shock, but it was only the beginning of a series of triumphs which would last until the early 16th century. The surprise rout at Morgarten forced the Swiss to reflect on the purpose of their confederation. What was required was greater clarity of intention, and a new treaty was drawn up on the 9th of December, 1315, in which the essential foundation of the Swiss Confederation, as they were to remain until the end of the Ancien Origine, were put in writing. The Confederate had a pragmatic sense of the benefits of their union. It would bring internal peace and rule of law, as well as a degree of security in the proscription of foreign alliances, which did not have unanimous consent. Okay. Through the 14th and 15th centuries, the disputes between the Swiss and the Habsburgs rumbled on. They rumbled on, largely unresolved. The Habsburgs stood by their claims to territories within the Confederation, whilst the Swiss countered that they were free communes directly subject to the Holy Roman Emperor. Such bold assertions, as the Confederates learned to their cost, rang hollow unless backed by the force of arms. The goodwill of distant emperors in the 15th century was distant. No monarch was prepared to put an army in the field to defend the rights of peasant communes, and although the houses of Luxembourg and Wittelsbach sought to keep the imperial crown out of the Habsburgs' hands, they were little troubled by the regional territorial interests of their rival. Internally, there was also complications. Many among the Confederate elites, particularly in the cities, were reliant upon Habsburgs' patronage. The guilds and merchants were particularly well aware of the fact that Habsburgs controlled many of the major trade routes through the Confederation. Anti-Habsburg sentiments among the Swiss were less well-defined than contemporary authors sought to portray. The aggressive expansion pursued by the Swiss at the beginning in the 14th century was essentially forced upon them as a matter of survival. The valleys that formed in the nucleus of the alliance held perhaps 30 to 40,000 souls, most of whom barely eked out living from the infertile mountain soil. The land may not have been arable, but what the valleys offered were natural fortifications virtually impregnable to assault by larger armies. As the Confederation expanded to survive, its topographical character was transformed by the addition of new, non-mountainous members such as Lucerne in 1332. The decision of the towns to join the Confederation was entirely pragmatic. In Lucerne, the well-to-do merchants despite some benefits, generally felt stifled by the agrarian nature of Habsburg rule, and they came to believe that their economic prosperity would be better served by an alliance with the dynasty's enemies. Zurich was a different case. It was a powerful city with 2 royal abbeys and a considerable amount of territory. It had become an imperial city in the 13th century when, in 1245, it had sided with the emperor against the pope. The result of this judicious alliance was the expulsion of a large portion of the clergy from the city and the acquisition by the council of toll, coinage, and market rights which had belonged to the church. By the 14th century, the emerging guilds in Zurich sought to displace the patrician families, but they needed leverage from outside the city. There were 2 options, the Austrians or the other Confederates. The knight Rudolf Brunn, 1324 to 1360, brought about a revolution in the city through the effective alliance of nobility with the craft guilds. Brunn chose the Confederates as allies over the Austrians, despite their close connections with the Zurich patrician families, and the city entered into the Confederation in 1351. That is, Zurich entered the Confederation in 1351. With the addition of Lucerne and Zurich, the Confederation moved out of the central valleys and into the rolling hills of the lower lands. This brought advantages as well as dangers. With Lucerne as an ally, for example, the Confederation surrounded the Lake of Lucerne, an important waterway leading to the St. Gothard Pass. At the same time, the fledgling alliance, no longer entirely walled in by mountains, was exposed to military might of its enemies, who were eager to meet on an open battlefield. The entry of new states, plural, orte, also changed the structure of the Confederation. The terms by which these new confederates joined were not identical. Zurich crucially retained the right to make separate alliances with other powers, though the Confederation was promised first place in its affections. Glarus and Zug were admitted in 1352 when the Confederates liberated the Glarians from their overlord, the monastery at Sackingen on the Rhine, a Habsburg foundation. And then subsequent wars meant that these 2 Confederates were briefly lost before returning at the end of the century. Glarus became a full member in 1388 following the Battle of Naufels. These 2 additions added another aspect to the Confederation. They were admitted as subordinate members required to follow the instructions of the more senior Confederates. The addition of Zurich in 1351 was balanced in the west by the admission of Bern 2 years later. And Bern and Zurich had much in common. Both had emerged from the feudal rule of the Zaringer dynasty and were approximately the same size, with about 5,000 or 6,000 inhabitants. Bern, however, did not lie on the great trade routes between the Rhine and Italy, and then therefore became a center of government, plying the trade of war. The city had been established in the 12th century as a military outpost to guard against the French, and mentally it faced west. Okay? The Bernese were aggressive and expansionist, and by the middle of the 14th century, they had moved beyond the city walls to seize control of many of the failing feudal territories in the surrounding countryside. It was a desire to secure these territorial gains which had brought the Bernese into the Confederation. They were not as much interested in the anti-Habsburg politics which had forged the initial alliance. Indeed, the Bernese made peace treaties with the Habsburgs in 1358, 1363, and 1370 in order to pursue their acquisition of lands with impunity. Bernese interests were closely entangled with the dynasty, and only 1 year, that's 1357, after joining the Confederation, Bern took part of the Habsburg siege of Zurich, a fellow Confederate. Rude. If the Bernese saw themselves as the natural rivals of Zurich, and if they saw the Habsburgs as convenient allies rather than reviled foes, they clearly felt nothing for the communal interests of the peasants so much at the heart of the states of Uri, Switch, and Unterwalden. From the perspective of Bern, the Confederation was a useful bulwark against foreign predators and little more. Bern played a canny game within the alliance, choosing to enter into military conflicts only when it saw the opportunity to prize land from others. Prize, P-R-I-S-E. Prize, to prize land from others. I am not familiar with that verb. At the key battles of Sempak, 1386, and Nafez in 1388, where peasant armies once again laid low the Austrian forces, the Bernese were not present, though they moved quickly in the wake of these victories to secure the spoils. Looking at the final years of the 14th century, it is impossible to speak of the Swiss Confederation as anything other than a jumble of alliances. As one historian has written, quote, "The Confederacy possessed no constitution, no regular representative assembly, no executive organs, no capital, no treasury, no chancery, no depository for documents, not even a seal of its own." Unquote. It was a rudimentary federal system composed of members who were neither equal nor similar, and, as the events of the 14th and 15th centuries amply demonstrated, the Confederates had rather elastic interpretations of their obligations. Some, such as Glarus and Zug, continued to pay money to the Habsburgs, although they were no longer under the political authority of that dynasty. More importantly, the urban and rural members of the Confederation had two very different and rather antagonistic cultures. The original three states, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, were carved from the mountain valleys, a world apart from the changing urban worlds of late medieval Zurich and Bern, where the newer craft guilds were wresting control of civic affairs from the patrician families. In one respect, the urban and rural states stood in particular contrast. In places such as Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, the Landsgemeinde, a popular assembly, was sovereign. These assemblies would delegate particular businesses to elected officials, and indeed, local families began to assert themselves in particular regions. As we shall see, this was replicated in the local Gemeinden, or communities, where each village had its elected officials who acted on behalf of the body. Against this form of popular government in the rural areas, the urban centers of Zurich and Bern were dominated by oligarchies. In Lucerne and Bern, the towns were governed by patrician merchants, in part descended from the old noble families. Zurich alone in the 14th century had succeeded in imposing a guild structure. To the end of the 14th century, however, brought significant changes to the Confederation in the form of two important documents. Two oh-so important documents. In 1370, the priests' ordinances, agreed by all the Confederates except Bern and Glarus, established that all residents of the Confederation, lay and clerical alike, were bound by oath to the Duke of Austria and had to take another oath to the Confederation, which took precedence. Further, no appeal was to be made to any court, lay or ecclesiastical, outside the Confederation, and provision on the principal roads. I just skipped an entire sentence. Let's try again. Further, no appeal was to be made to any court, lay, or ecclesiastical outside the Confederation, and provision was taken against private warfare and for the maintaining of peace on the principal roads. The second text was the Sempak Covenant of 1393, in which common actions for the enforcement of laws and conduct of warfare were agreed. Particular attention was given to the vexations of plundering, especially of religious houses and churches, and violence against women. Well, that's good. The 15th century has been described as a golden age for the Swiss. Without doubt, the 100 years before the Reformation saw a dramatic expansion of the Confederation and, perhaps most importantly, a prominent role for the Swiss on the larger stage of European affairs. It was the Swiss mercenary who became the currency of the newly minted importance. The poor soil of the mountain valleys could not sustain the relatively modest population, forcing young men to move off the land and find new paymasters. The endless wars of the 14th and 15th centuries made mercenary service a lucrative employment, although a recent study has suggested that mercenaries gained little social advancement through their prowess on the battlefield, and that the traditional elites retained control of the military. The Swiss had emerged as mercenaries in the 13th century. The rugged, well-conditioned mountain men wielded the halberd, an 8-foot shaft with an axe at one end and a hook or spear at the other. This remained the standard weapon of the Swiss mercenaries until the 15th century when they took up the pike, which had been imported from Italy. That's a curve-billed thrasher on the background. Not sure if the microphone's picking that up, but in case you wondered. The fame of the Swiss on the battlefield owed much to their acumen in combat and their undoubted courage. They were referred to by the Austrians as the Montagnes Bestiales. The Swiss were shrewd fighters who chose their positions well, and their reputation was based on their ability to defeat armies of much greater size. The military success of the Swiss was above all due to two factors: efficient organization and good discipline. Each of the 8 states was responsible for providing, equipping, and training its own forces, and this was facilitated by the introduction of conscription in the middle of the 15th century. Conscription. Fun. This meant that the Swiss could quickly field an army of around 55,000. The main bulk of these armies consists of unmarried men between the ages of 18 and 30, but there were also contingents of older men who were prepared to participate in campaigns. Behind these armies was a large militia made up by the rest of the male population, which was prepared to fight in an emergency. Each village and city had detailed accounts of the number of men to be recruited and what weapons they should use. The responsibilities of each confederate and of each community within the confederation were set out precisely. All of this was underpinned by the Sempak Covenant of 1393, which laid down both the conditions of military cooperation between the states and a strict, also strict code of conduct for the contingents to control discipline. Officers were elected by the elders of the community when the troops were summoned, and campaigns were conducted by councils of war at which the military leaders of each state gathered to make decisions collectively. Generally, only the supreme commander of a state's contingent was chosen by the rulers. The military system reflected the democratic communal traditions of the Swiss. Indeed, at some battles, such as Morat, there was no supreme commander, and the units acted fairly independently. Thus, despite being the great age of military success, the 15th century produced no memorable Swiss military heroes. However, what this tightly defined web of communal responsibilities did create was a society, highly capable for war, able to demolish the chivalric army of Burgundy, Ron Burgundy. The first Confederate conquest of the 15th century was the acquisition of the Aargau in 1415, a piece of verdant land south of the Rhine between Zurich and Bern. The Aargau was the homeland of the Habsburgs, and Bern persuaded the other Confederates to join in an invasion. A combined force quickly overran the territory, and the land was efficiently divided, with Bern seizing the lion's share from his former Habsburg ally. The remaining portions of the Aargau was to be administered jointly by other Confederates, except Bern and Uri. This was the first example of what was to become the common practice of mandated territories, an arrangement which would play a crucial role in the Reformation. In the Aargau, the jointly governed territory known as the Freiamt, was managed by bailiffs, appointed in turn by each of the controlling confederates, who ruled in the name of the whole confederation. These mandated territories were included in the confederation not as full members, but as occupied lands. I gotta find a warmer place to sit. Oh, so much better. While most of the Confederates viewed Habsburg Austria as the behemoth to be slain, this sentiment, we have noted, was not shared by Bern and Uri, whose territorial aspirations, despite their involvement in the Aargau, lay elsewhere. The Bernese had undertaken the accession of noble lands in the southeast castle by castle campaign, which drew them towards an inevitable conflict with the House of Savoy. You can see some foreshadowing. The House of Savoy at Geneva. For Uri, the natural realm of expansion was into the lands of the Duke of Milan south of the Alps. The rulers of Uri were especially concerned with the transalpine passes and the relevant commercial privileges. After some thoroughly indecisive military actions and subsequent financial transactions, the destitute nobleman Sax zu Misax sold his control over Bellinzona to Uri in 1419. A peace was mediated by Bern and Basel in 1426, giving some of the Italian lands to be jointly ruled by the Confederates. This messy arrangement left unresolved the territorial claims of Milan, and the Swiss driving home the point that in matters other than defense, the Swiss had little sense of mutual cooperation. The acquisition of the land by the Confederates took place through a variety of means: war, purchase, mortgage, and inheritance. The military campaigns resulted in considerable expansion, but more commonly and mundanely, it was money that secured the deal. The lower nobility and religious houses faced financial ruin on account of the spiraling costs of food and wages, just like today. And Zurich and Bern, with pockets full of money loaned by the wealthy Baselers, appropriated the right of protection over territories through either outright purchase or by the extension of loans, which the owners could not ever repay. The territorial aspirations of the states, it must be remembered, had much more to do with particular interests than with any common agenda for enlarging the Confederation, and conflicts were inevitable and frequent. A particularly nasty example was the rivalry between Zurich and Schwyz, who jostled for control of the trade routes in the east through mountainous Toggenburg, whose childless duke lay dying. Frederick VII was the last of the great feudal lords in the region, and he had carefully cultivated a web of trade agreements with the various confederates. His death in 1436 unleashed a bitter struggle for his vast compilation of lands. What became known as the Old Zurich War, 1439 to 1450, very nearly became the fragile Confederation crashing down, and its consequences were to be felt 75 years later when Zurich used the Reformation to reopen its expansionist dreams. Under the leadership of Burgermeister Stassi, Zurich pressed its case for Toggenburg by closing its markets to the other Confederates, a cruel measure against the rural peasants, and by concluding a pact with Austria on the 17th of June, 1442. It will be remembered that Zurich was entitled under the terms of her entry into the Confederation to make foreign alliances, but an alliance with Austria was an unforgivable act of, let's try this again. It will be remembered that Zurich was entitled under the terms of her entry into the Confederation to make foreign alliances, but an alliance with Austria was an unforgivable act of mendacity. He's missing the article here. It should read, but an alliance with Austria was an unforgivable act of mendacity. The "an" is missing. That has caused me to struggle. Zurich, it was very apparent, had no qualms about using her position as an imperial free city to damage the Confederation when circumstances required, while the Austrians saw in their territorial aspirations of Zurich their best hope of bringing the Swiss to heel. The other Confederates rushed to arms. The resolution was brutal and bloody. It was a remarkable battle between 30,000 Armagnac troops given to the Austrians by Charles VII of France, and 1,200 to 1,500 Confederate troops at the Leper House of St. Jacob on the Burs on 26 August 1444. Yes, we're still recording. The battlefield was visible from the walls of Basel, where a council of the church was meeting, and the Confederates, desperately outnumbered, were cut to pieces. The massacre of Confederate soldiers was not in vain, however, as the losses they inflicted upon the opposition were so enormous that the victors were forced to sue for peace, thus confirming the place of the martyred Swiss in the developing mythology of the Confederation. Sue for peace. No explanation, but sounds terrible. At the Peace of Ensenheim In October 1444, the French recognized, for the first time, that there was a new political entity on their eastern frontier. For the Swiss, their victory and defeat was bittersweet. It had been the first civil war in the Confederation, and it had revealed the shallowness of Zurich's commitment to the principles of union. When push came to shove, territorial expansion and economic hegemony ran as deeply as, there's also a missing article here, as deeply as any sense of fraternity. Okay. The battle also put paid to Austrian hopes of bringing the Swiss lands back under their control. The Austrians had tired of the Swiss, who had humiliated them once again, and who had now established an international reputation as ferocious fighters. The kings of France themselves began to ponder the usefulness of these peasants. The cities of Fribourg, St. Gall, Schaffhausen, the abbeys of St. Gall and Reichenau and Appenzell, and sensed the changing winds and exchanged Austrian patronage for alliances with Swiss confederates. What the old Zurich War demonstrated, however, was that despite their differences, the Swiss confederates could not easily disentangle themselves. They were bound together in a system in which security was preserved by checks and balances, in which any single member could be silenced by the collective weight of the others. The second half of the 15th century saw the continued growth of the Confederation and a central role in European politics. In 1452, that's 40 years before Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, the Confederates of the Old League of Upper Germany, as the Swiss styled themselves, concluded their first treaty with the French. It was at this time that the Confederation began to gather the Zugewandte Orte, or associated districts, which were closely linked to the Confederation without having the status of full membership. Among these associates, three, the Abbot, 1451, the town of St. Gall, 1454, and the town of Biel, were given seats at the Swiss Diet. Those connected to the Swiss as Confederati, not so closely bound, included the Wallis, 1416-17, Schaffhausen, 1454, Rottweil, 1463, Mulhausen, 1466, Neuchâtel, the Graubünden, and Appenzell, 1452. These associated states were bound by the ancient practice of commendation. That is, they were required to follow orders in matters of military, campaigns, and peace treaties. The Swiss relieved the Habsburgs of the last of their lands south of the Rhine when they seized the Thurgau in 1460 and then purchased Winterthur in 1467. The Thurgau was to be governed as a mandated territory. In 1468, the Bernese laid siege to the Rhenish towns of Rheinfelden, Sackingen, Laufenburg, and Waldshut, which, for the most part, were not inclined to exchange their languid administration of the Austrians for the more aggressive Bernese. Sigismund, Archduke of Austria, offered to buy off the Swiss with 10,000 gulden on the condition that if he did not pay up, the towns would pass to the control of the Confederates. Inevitably, Sigismund was unable to pay and turned instead to Charles the Bold of Burgundy to bail him out. The Swiss drove a hard bargain, but more importantly, their success along the Rhine brought them into conflict with the Burgundians. It was the Bernese who were primarily interested in defeating the Burgundians, whom they saw as a threat to their plans in the west against Savoy. During the 1470s, alliances began to shift. The major players were Charles of Burgundy, Louis XI of France, the hapless Sigismund, and the Swiss. Charles and Louis were in open rivalry, but the thinly veiled ambitions of Charles, combined with the brutal treatment of the Alsatians by his lieutenant Peter von Hagenbach, lost the Burgundians the support of both Sigismund and the Swiss. Charles believed he had to destroy this new rival on his southeastern frontier. In January 1467, Charles crossed the border into the Jura and successfully laid siege to the castle at Grandson. grandson. Of the 412 occupants of the castle, 410 were slaughtered. The 2 men spared had been forced to act as executioners. That sucks. Some day later, a Swiss army of 18,000 men met the Burgundians on the shores of Lake Neuchâtel. A failure of communications among the Burgundians led to panic when the Swiss appeared to have outflanked them. The terrifying sounds of the Swiss war horns, along with their reputation for dispatching captives, unnerved the Burgundian soldiers who fled the field. The Battle of Grandson was a classic encounter of the Swiss pikemen and halberdiers. I think I know how to say that. Yeah. Against heavy war horses. The victory was total. The booty brought great wealth to the Swiss. 400 cannon, 800 arquebuses, 10,000 horses, jewels, silver, and tapestries worth 3 million florins. Charles retreated to Tucson to lick his wounds and regroup his army. He was determined to take on Bern directly, and he moved against the city, laying siege to Morat, where on the 22nd of June, the decisive battle took place. Once again, the Swiss outflanked the Burgundians, and this time, in driving rain, they crashed through Charles's palisaded camp, resulting in an utter rout. R-O-U-T. Don't know what that means. That sounds terrible. The losses were staggering. 10,000 Burgundians lay dead against a mere 410 Swiss. As the Burgundians had feared, no prisoners were taken and no ransom demanded. Charles's soldiers were driven into the lake by the Swiss, where they were either drowned or had their throats cut. The final battle came at Nancy in January of 1477, when Charles attempted to retake the city, which had fallen to an army from Lorraine the previous October. Charles was determined to lay siege to the city, and upon hearing that a Confederate army was advancing to relieve the city, he decided to attack. In snow and freezing weather, the Swiss troops effectively carried out a pincer movement against the Burgundians, whose horses and artillery proved disastrously useless against flexible infantry formations. Swiss pikes crashed through the Burgundian central position, and panic broke. The slaughter, even by the standards of earlier battles, was horrendous, and Charles's mutilated body was found several days later. The Burgundian War brought a sea change to the Confederation. As a consequence of the victory, Fribourg and Solothurn joined as the 9th and 10th members. This was especially significant as Fribourg was the first French-speaking land to become full member of what had previously been a purely German-speaking league. That'd be a good trivia question right there. Fribourg, first French-speaking land. Okay, the destruction of the Burgundian army, first at Grandson and Morat, and then finally under the walls of Nancy, placed the Swiss on the map. Not only were they admired for their military powers, but they were now treated as something more than rebellious peasants. This is maybe halfway through, optimistically. Oh, super optimistically. Yeah, but so good. That's the first chapter. Peasants, priests, and soldiers, and we'll continue this whenever.